All right, folks. Buckle up for a deep dive that's less wonk-fest and more like, well, it's juicier than a political thriller, that's for sure.
Sounds intriguing already.
Today, we're diving headfirst into Seth Abramson's latest on Proof. You know that Substack that digs deep, deep into the underbelly of American politics?
Oh yeah, I'm familiar. Always a wild ride.
This time, he's dropped a bombshell about, get this, Trump and Laura Loomer?
Loomer. Really? Okay, you have my attention.
I know, right? But before you think, oh no, not Loomer again, trust me on this one. This piece, it goes way beyond just the headlines, you know? It's about this disturbing trend we're seeing in U.S. politics, how these seemingly isolated figures, like Loomer, can gain a foothold in the halls of power, and what that means for all of us.
Okay, so it's bigger than just Loomer being Loomer. I'm listening.
Exactly. So first things first, who is Laura Loomer? And why should we even care about her connection to Trump?
Right, good question. I mean, most people probably remember her for, well, let's just say her more outlandish stunts,
Yeah, she's not exactly known for subtlety.
to put it mildly. But Abramson paints a pretty stark picture of her in this piece. He calls her out as a fringe right conspiracy theorist, white nationalist, even a proud Islamophobe.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches, that's for sure.
He really doesn't. And that's what makes this whole thing so unsettling. It's not just about some random provocateur on the internet. Loomer has a history of, inserting herself into these powerful circles. She even worked on Trump's 2020 campaign, if you remember.
Oh, yeah, I remember. And she's ridiculously open about her adoration for Trump. The article even quotes her saying things like, there's nothing I wouldn't do for him. It's giving obsessive fan vibes, which is a little, ugh.
More than a little unnerving considering her history.
Exactly.
And that's precisely what makes this relationship so alarming. Abramson argues she's a symptom of this worrying trend, the normalization of these extreme views within the MAGA movement. And her proximity to Trump, her willingness to go to any lengths for his attention, it's like, well, it suggests a way for those beliefs to actually influence policy, to shape the national conversation, and not in the good way.
It's like she's figured out how to weaponize her outrageous behavior to make herself impossible to ignore.
Precisely. And that's why Abramson sees her as even more alarming than some of Trump's other, shall we say, colorful allies.
Right, because there's a long list of those.
Oh, absolutely. But he even goes so far as to suggest she might be vying for a role similar to Hope Hicks, remember her? Trump's de facto first lady for a time.
Oh, yeah?
Now imagine, just for a second, someone like Loomer with that level of access, with that kind of influence on a global stage. It's, well,
A diplomatic nightmare waiting to happen.
to say the least.
Okay, we have to address the elephant in the room here, the Milo Yiannopoulos allegations. Things get really wild really fast. For those who don't know, Milo is, well, he's a piece of work, right? Former Breitbart editor, professional provocateur, banned from basically every platform imaginable.
And importantly, a former confidant of Loomer's, someone who's been deeply embedded in this whole world,
Right, not exactly a source you'd expect to be reliable at first glance.
to put it mildly.
But here's the thing. The article points out that Milo, for all his flaws, has a track record of being right about these kinds of scandals.
It's true.
He's exposed the underbelly of the alt-right before, and he's not afraid to name names. So what's he saying about Loomer and Trump?
Well, according to Yiannopoulos, Loomer's been bragging about having a sexual relationship with Trump, specifically that she performed oral sex on him.
Whoa, hold on. She's just telling people this.
That's what he claims. And he says the story's been spreading like wildfire, even reaching Republican lawmakers. Abramson even writes that Trump went so far as to ban Loomer from his plane, a very public humiliation, seemingly to try and contain the fallout.
Okay, but how credible is any of this, really? Can we really take Milo at his word?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Yiannopoulos is a known provocateur, someone who seems to, well, thrive on chaos and controversy. But he has been right before, and even just the allegation itself has sent shockwaves through, well, everywhere. It's made a lot of people stop and take notice.
Yeah, and Abramson draws a really interesting parallel to the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, of all things. Remember Linda Tripp, the one who secretly recorded Monica Lewinsky?
Oh, how could we forget?
Well, Yiannopoulos, like Tripp, was close with Loomer. He even ghost-wrote her first book, according to the article. That's a lot of access, a lot of opportunity to have, well, heard things.
Definitely puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
It does, but even if we set aside whether it's true for a moment, why is this allegation so explosive? I mean, Trump's personal life has never exactly been a secret, right?
That's true, but this isn't just about infidelity. This is about the potential for blackmail. The leverage this kind of information could give Loomer over someone as, well, as powerful and as volatile as Trump.
Especially with her connections to some shady characters, the Tenet Six, for example, that group that's constantly spreading disinformation online. And then there's the whole thing about her receiving payments from Russia.
Exactly. This is someone who's already shown a willingness to work with and potentially be manipulated by foreign actors.
Hmm.
If she does have compromising information on Trump, the stakes are incredibly high. We're not just talking about a personal scandal anymore. This has the potential to impact national security.
And it plays right into those existing narratives about Trump, the instability, the lack of judgment, his susceptibility to influence. Even if none of this is true, the allegation alone is incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. It raises serious questions about his fitness for office, his ability to make sound decisions, especially when it comes to, like I said, matters of national security.
Okay, so we've got a potential sex scandal, possible blackmail, this web of connections to extremist groups. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
We're catching on. This might not even be about the sex at all, as Abramson argues. There's a much bigger and, frankly, much scarier implication to this whole story.
Oh, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. Tell me more.
Let's talk about the pipeline.
The pipeline. What pipeline?
Abramson argues that Loomer is part of this dangerous pipeline connecting these fringe figures to mainstream politics, ultimately leading to real-world violence.
Wait, hold on. You're saying there's a direct line from Laura Loomer to, say, the January 6th insurrection?
It's not quite that simple, but the connection is there. Let's unpack it after a quick break.
All right, so before the break, we were teetering on the edge of this metaphorical pipeline, linking figures like Laura Loomer to real-world violence. This is where my brain starts short-circuiting a little, I gotta say.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Help me connect the dots here.
Okay, well, it's complex, but Abramson does lay out the connections pretty clearly. He argues that online spaces, particularly those that cater to, more extreme views, they can act as incubators for violence, like ideas that might seem fringe or contained within those echo chambers. They can actually find their way into the mainstream, amplified and validated by figures like Loomer, who have a foot in both worlds, so to speak.
So you're saying those inflammatory memes and conspiracy theories that we see circulating online, they're not just harmless venting. They can actually translate into real-world action.
Exactly. And Loomer, with her massive online following, her history of those over-the-top stunts, she's like a one-woman misinformation machine. The article highlights how she's repeatedly pushed baseless claims about everything from immigrants to election fraud, often echoing almost verbatim Trump's own rhetoric.
Right, and it's not just talk. We saw this happen with those lies about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Loomer was one of the loudest voices pushing that conspiracy theory, and it directly led to bomb threats being called in against schools and hospitals.
It's terrifying how quickly that can escalate.
It really is.
And it gets even more unsettling when you consider her ties to groups like the Proud Boys.
Oh boy, yeah.
A far-right extremist organization with a very real history of violence. They were key players in the January 6th attack. And Abramson argues that Loomer's rhetoric, her constant demonization of the other, it creates this climate where that kind of violence starts to feel justified.
So it's this feedback loop, like the online hate fuels the real-world actions, which then get amplified online, and on it goes.
Exactly, a vicious cycle. And that's why Abramson keeps coming back to this idea of a pipeline. It's not necessarily about a coordinated conspiracy, but this dangerous progression where figures like Loomer act as a bridge between the online world of extremism and mainstream politics, ultimately making violence more likely.
Okay, that makes sense. But I gotta ask, civil war, that seems a bit extreme even with all this, doesn't it?
You're right, a full-blown civil war is like a worst-case scenario. And frankly, it's unlikely. But we do have to acknowledge the very real potential for widespread civil unrest, especially given the current political climate.
So what are the potential triggers? What should we be watching out for? What should people be paying attention to?
I'd say keep a very close eye on the rhetoric coming from Trump and his allies. Are they escalating their language? Are they making threats, even veiled threats, or hinting at violence if things don't go their way?
So it's not just about what's happening in the streets, but what's being said online and by those in positions of power.
Absolutely. Monitor those online spaces for any signs of escalating threats or calls to action, particularly from groups like we mentioned, the Proud Boys. And be aware of those potential flashpoints in the news cycle, a Trump indictment, a contested election result, anything that could further inflame an already tense situation.
It's a lot to be vigilant about, for sure. What can everyday people do to feel less, I don't know, powerless in all of this, it can feel really overwhelming.
Knowledge is power. Stay informed, be critical of what you see, especially online, and be prepared. Have a plan, just in case things do escalate. Know where you'll go, who you'll contact, how you'll stay safe. And most importantly, don't underestimate the ripple effects of this kind of unrest. Even if you think, oh, this won't affect me, the economic fallout, the erosion of trust, the normalization of extremism, these things impact all of us, one way or another.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one. We can't afford to be complacent, to think this is just someone else's problem. Okay, so we've talked about the potential for violence, the influence of misinformation, this dangerous network surrounding Loomer. But what does this whole situation say about Trump himself?
At the very least, it speaks to a level of recklessness, a disregard for the potential consequences of his actions, that's for sure. This is a man facing multiple indictments, trying to regain the presidency, and he continues to surround himself with figures like Loomer, who, let's be honest, seem far more interested in sowing chaos than governing responsibly.
It's like he's drawn to this chaotic energy, even when it's clearly a threat to his own interests, even to the country.
And Abramson argues that this is a pattern with Trump. He surrounds himself with yes men, with people who tell him what he wants to hear, who validate his grievances, fuel his worst impulses, regardless of the consequences.
And Loomer seems to fit that description to a T. She's utterly devoted to him, even referring to herself as a proud Islamophobe at a white nationalist conference, echoing his own rhetoric. It's like she's a mirror reflecting back his most extreme views, and that's a terrifying prospect.
It's not just a matter of personal beliefs, though. It's about normalizing that extremism, giving a platform to hate and violence. And when that happens, it's not just those fringe figures who become more dangerous, it's the entire system that's put at risk.
It's like this whole situation, as shocking as it is, feels almost inevitable.
It does, doesn't it? That's what's so unsettling. This is Trump we're talking about, a man who has shown time and time again that he's willing to put his own interests above the good of the country, a man who thrives on chaos and division.
It's almost as if he was destined to find himself in this position, surrounded by these figures, facing these accusations. So where do we go from here? What happens next?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I'm afraid there's no easy answer.
And we're back for the final act of this wild, wild deep dive. I feel like we've gone from salacious gossip to, like, potential blackmail, from shadowy networks to talk of, like, actual civil unrest. It's a lot, even for a show called The Deep Dive.
It is a lot to unpack, that's for sure. But you're right, it goes way beyond the headlines, way beyond just the shock value.
That's what keeps sticking with me, you know? It's easy to get caught up in the scandal, the just sheer outrageousness of it all. But this isn't just about Trump and Loomer, right? This is about us. It's about the state of our democracy, the very real threats we're facing. This isn't some far-off problem.
No, it's not. And Abramson makes that very clear. He argues this whole situation, bizarre as it is, it's like a microcosm, of these much larger forces that are at play, forces that are really kind of reshaping, warping the landscape of American politics.
It's like this whole Loomer saga, it's holding up this like distorted mirror to all the dysfunction, the extremism, the anger that's been simmering, right below the surface for years now.
Yeah, exactly. And these are problems that don't just disappear with a new president or just fade away when the news cycle moves on.
So what do we do with that? Like, how do we even begin to move forward? What's the takeaway for the average listener who might be feeling, I don't know, overwhelmed, maybe tempted to just tune it all out? Like, oh, this is just another crazy Trump story.
The most important thing is to stay engaged, to refuse to become numb to all of it. Don't tune out. Pay attention to what's happening, not just on the national stage, but in your own communities as well.
Right, because as we've been talking about, this isn't a spectator sport. Democracy demands participation, vigilance from all of us.
Exactly. Hold our leaders accountable. And I mean all of them, regardless of party. Call out misinformation and extremism when you see it, whether it's from a friend, a family member, or some random person online. Support organizations that are actually working to, strengthen our democracy, to fight disinformation, to promote civic engagement. That's huge.
And maybe most importantly, or at least just as importantly, keep those lines of communication open, even with people you disagree with, right? We can't just retreat into our little echo chambers and hope for the best.
It's more important now than ever, I think, to have those tough conversations, to try to build bridges, to really, recommit ourselves to those values that underpin a healthy democracy. Because this is a moment where we get to decide what kind of future we want, what kind of future we're going to build to get it.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, we want to leave you with one final thought, something to chew on, maybe spark some more of those conversations. Abramson says that the most disturbing part of this whole story, the thing that really stuck with him, was how unsurprising it all felt. How did we get here? And what are WE, each and every one of us, going to do about it? That's all the time we have for today. But we'll be back next week with another deep dive, exploring a new topic, unpacking its complexities. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and as always, thanks for listening.